Now, how is it to be a company in the midst of the transition? Starting out as an oil and gas producer, slowly turning into a broad energy company, and eventually ending up with a net zero ambition for 2050? Does it matter to the investors that the company has set ambitious goals? Are they believing in and joining that journey? And is there a difference between private and public owners in that regard? I guess Ulrica Fearn, CFO and Executive Vice President at Equinor, is going to give us a few hints on all this now. She and Equinor do sit on both sides of the table as an investor object and as an active investor themselves. Today, though, I believe Ulrica will focus on the investor object perspective first and foremost. Prior to Equinor's General Assembly this spring, the company has just launched its energy transition plan, mapping out the road to net zero in 2050. Now, what impact does such a plan have on the company's value, I wonder? Let's find out by giving the word and the stage to Ulrica Fearn.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and it's great being here today. My first visit to Trondheim, and also, of course, on this set of interesting topics that we're talking about today. So, in my view, over the last years, the shift in finance has been very, very clear. Both in terms of concrete actions, but also in letters to the CEOs, but also in letters of expectations to companies, but also in terms of more informal, I'd say sort of equally noticeable change in the dialogue. What questions are being asked and what are being signaled in meetings? As the CFO of Equinor, I see and feel that change directly, both as an investment object, but also as an investor into the transition, and listening to our financiers, the banks, the analysts, and the investors themselves. And we get a lot of scrutiny on the criteria, how we invest, and what we do, both from ourselves and from that environment. So let me share some reflections on both perspectives, but first, how we perceive the changes among the larger community, where, for example, the Norwegian Bank of Investment Management, Carina, is one of the leaders in the pack with clear expectations on companies. Investors' interest in sustainability, or ESG, has developed over the last decade. It has also matured, I'd say, both in terms of moving from an approach of just divestment to clear expectations and active involvement as well as metrics. And I would say we're still on that journey, trying to figure out and align the best metrics for each industry. There has been an increase in marketing of sustainable investing, and our investors are facing increased pressure from their investors. And as a result, we've seen a development of multiple benchmarks and metrics. Let me still try to give a few highlights that stands out. Oh, this is not going to be very interesting for you. You can read it if you like. That's more interesting. When APG announced an increase in focus on carbon footprint in 2015, and Mark Carney, chair of Bank of England, focused on systemic risk and value destruction, this marked an even larger shift. For Equinor, it's been important to develop a strategy that will enable to deliver on our purpose also in a low-carbon future, as you heard before. The maturation of the debate, metrics, and approach among investors has made this development necessary, but I would say also a little bit easier to some extent. With our purpose of turning natural resources into energy for people and progress for society, we find a good fit with these investor expectations. And we meet with investors across the range, from those who have a little bit more near-term cash-focused targets to those with long-term vision and on sustainability and returns. It is also clear that no investor is focused just on climate and sustainability. They also expect to generate returns. So the maturation of the finance industry has led to a more agreed upon approach from how traditional oil and gas companies can be expected to take part in the energy transition. Shutting down production instantly will neither be sustainable for societies nor create any value. However, we should meet clear expectations on how to plan and invest and develop our portfolio, and how this meets the expectations on climate, but also the future need of energy to societies. And of course then, what kind of returns we can expect given those priorities. So you will see in our reporting that we are increasingly detailed on the sustainability metrics, as we heard in the beginning of this session. That's required, but it's also about transparency. And as a CFO, the focus I see from investors and banks is the forward-looking capital allocation and carbon emission reductions, as well as the current metrics. And I completely agree with them. The transition of energy system will require huge investments. And the real test of companies is not what they talk about, but where they put the money and what they plan to do and how they act. On investments, Equinor started our transition having made clear and determined ambitions going forward. In 2020, you heard earlier, we spent about 4% of gross investments on renewables and low-carbon solutions. In 2021, in answer to the question before, it had climbed to 11%. By 2030, 50% of gross investments will go into renewable and low-carbon solution. And this means a significant shift for us, because this also means that we need to put forward and develop the technology, projects, and value chains to deliver on that. It's not just about putting an ambition to invest a big amount of money. We need to make projects, and they need to be profitable in the long term to create a sustainable model that creates energy supply for the future. Long-term profitability has to be the base requirement, also within a low-carbon and renewable future. For Equinor, the energy transition and acting on climate is closely linked. So we believe the world will need oil and gas for a long time. And while we develop other energy resources, we must strive to provide oil and gas that is needed as low of emissions and cost as possible. And that is why our efforts to cut our own emissions is also one of the recurring topics with investors and banks. And in our energy transition plan, which is up for an advisory vote in our annual general meeting later on, we demonstrate a credible strategy with an action-oriented plan that is needed to achieve our net zero ambition whilst helping the world towards the same outcome. So let me give you some short comments on how we act as an investor and how we have matured our approach in both practices and also in the formalities. But maybe more important than our formal reporting, it's what we do there in practice. So as much as we're putting more and more metrics in, we're sharing more and more as we can, as it becomes more standard, it's what we do in practice that really counts, in the day-to-day evaluation and the investment decisions. With an ambition to be the leading company in an energy transition, it is not enough to follow today's standards and expectation, we have to be in front. For instance, this means that when we incorporate CO2 tax, we do that for all projects when checking their robustness, even in countries where such thing doesn't exist and haven't even been discussed. Climate considerations are impacting our risk mapping of our calculations on impairments and expected cash flows, and being very thorough on all of that. The energy industry has long perspectives. Our projects are large and take years to develop from idea to production, both in oil and gas, but also in renewables. And this means that we have to consider not only regulations right now and expectations in the medium term, but we have to face into the future when considering a project and also try to foresee how the world looks when the project is in operation years from now. So it's hard to predict how the world will develop, but I expect the approach to energy transition to further develop within international finance, and aligning metrics and standards. Governments and regulators, of course, will play a key role here, as seen in the development around the EU taxonomy. But I also expect it to become a bit more nuanced, with added weight to need for energy security and transition energy sources that we saw in the early days of this shift. So I think I'll end with that conclusion. I believe it's a real shift. Thank you.